Sean Combs tried to kill a record executive? If you've been following the headlines, a past incident involving the embattled rapper and producer has come into the spotlight, and we're going to break it down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Obviously, when we talk about Sean Diddy Combs and his current legal troubles, there is a large conversation about his past. I mean, for the guy who prosecutors say engaged in a pervasive and repeated pattern for years of abuse towards people, particularly women, and using violence and threats and force and coercion to manipulate them into engaging in sex performances with male sex workers known as freak-offs, you gotta talk about the past. You gotta talk about past instances or allegations of his violent side. The guy's currently facing federal sex trafficking, racketeering, and prostitution charges. Violence is at the center of that. Now, of course, it becomes a question of what will actually make its way into a criminal trial currently scheduled for May of 2025, how expansive that will be. But we're also trying to get a more comprehensive understanding of the Diddy story for ourselves. We aren't limited to just focusing on the evidence and the allegations of the criminal case, but also the numerous allegations facing Sean Combs, including those in the many civil lawsuits that he currently faces. And there is one event that we want to focus on a little bit more right now. When Sean Combs attacked a record executive back in 1999. I'm talking about Interscope record executive Steven Stoute. And this all centered around the music video Hate Me Now by artist Nas. Now, Diddy was set to make an appearance in that music video. In fact, it was reported at the time that Sony had to pay an extra $14,000 just to accommodate Combs' request to be in that video. But the issue was that Diddy was to be seen crucified on a cross while wearing a crown made of thorns. And the story goes that Combs, he had already approved that. But then his mother, Janice Combs, and his pastor, Hezekiah Walker, they weren't too happy with what was being portrayed here. And Combs had reportedly then called Stoute saying, delete this scene. But apparently, one way or another, that video gets delivered to MTV, which, by the way, if you don't remember, MTV was huge with music videos back in the day. I don't know if it is currently. I haven't been following it. I feel like all they do is like reality shows. But anyway, that's a separate conversation. It went to MTV, Music Video Central. Now, Walker, again the pastor, reportedly calls Stoute saying, make this edit. The problem is, Stoute says he didn't have the authority to make a change like that. So what happens? The video gets published for the world to see, with that scene still there. Now, there's a back and forth about how this happened. Some say this was intentional to stir up controversy. Stoute says he never got instructions from Combs or Bad Boy Entertainment on what to do exactly, but the video aired. And then Stoute says Sean Combs calls him, starts screaming at him, hangs up. Then, Stoute says, a Bad Boy executive calls him back and says that an angry Sean Combs is on his way to his office. Just minutes later, and this is apparently captured on CCTV surveillance footage, it captures Combs and his associates entering the New York office of Universal Music Group where Stoute had worked. And Stoute says Combs comes into his office and then just punches him in the face and proceeds to beat him with a telephone. From there, he claims that Combs' associates, they jump in on the attack too, kicking him, punching him, hitting him with a chair. They apparently throw his desk over. They mess up the entire office. This is a vicious, vicious attack. And Stoute actually had to be taken to the hospital. As Stoute told the LA Times at the time, I was laying there on the floor bleeding. My jaw and my head were all swollen. I couldn't move my arm. It was a traumatic experience. And in the middle of it, I didn't know exactly how to feel. I was upset, embarrassed, scared, angry. As far as I'm concerned, this was an attempt on my life. The only reason I'm not dead is because they missed. He went on to say, if this kind of behavior is allowed to go on unpenalized, it'll be like an invitation for extortion in the music business. If somebody can get away with walking into the headquarters of the world's biggest record company and beating up a senior executive over a disagreement, I guarantee you this is going to be a great business for criminals to thrive in. Now, Stoute reported this to police, and they investigated. And you know what? Combs ended up turning himself in. He was arrested on felony assault charges. This didn't just go away. Well, kind of, because here's what happened. Combs ended up pleading guilty to a lesser charge of harassment. He was ordered to undergo an anger management program, and he wound up paying Stoute $500,000 in an out-of-court settlement. It was reportedly, though, not as a form of compensation per se, but it was labeled as producer and management fees. And considering Stoute was looking for $12 million for the attack, and Sean Combs was facing years in prison if he was convicted at a trial, gotta say, this was a pretty good deal for Sean Combs, considering what was alleged. Now, Combs released a statement at the time saying, "I'm glad to get this whole incident behind me, and it's now time for me to do what I do best, concentrate on my album, and give back to my fans." Now, obviously, we're talking about an intentional attack here, but personal injury cases, they can take all forms. And if you should find yourself in that position where you're injured, you need to know your legal rights, and you need to know whether you're entitled to compensation. And that is where Morgan & Morgan comes in, America's largest injury law firm, our sponsor. This is a firm that has a very impressive track record, including recent verdicts of $12 million in Florida, $26 million in Philadelphia, $6.8 million in New York. All of these, mind you, considerably higher than the highest insurance offers in these cases. There's no upfront fee. They only get paid if you get paid. The whole process can be done straight from your smartphone. It's that simple. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. The question becomes, or a big question becomes, could this factor into Sean Combs' criminal case right now? Because I want to read you a portion of what the government had to say in one of their bail letters where they were opposing Sean Combs' bail. And it was addressing the idea that there is not just one victim in this case. Sure, there is one victim that's identified in the sex trafficking charge in the indictment, but the prosecutors say there's more here. They write, "To be clear, despite the indictment naming one victim in count 2, and we believe that to be Cassandra Ventura, Sean Combs' ex, who originally filed a lawsuit against him back in November of 2023, alleging sex trafficking and sexual assault." But they write, "This case is not about just one victim. The government's evidence to date, including the defendant's own communications, demonstrates that the defendant has used force and coercion against multiple victims. In addition to these women, the defendant has assaulted a host of other individuals, including his employees and witnesses to his violence. For example, the defendant directed his rage toward his employees and those close to victim 1 who had seen him physically abuse victim 1, including by throwing these witnesses against walls and onto the ground, choking them and throwing objects at them, among other things, particularly when they attempted to protect victim 1. In doing so, the defendant has demonstrated that he's not only a danger to victims and witnesses, but is also obstructive and willing to engage whatever is necessary, including physical violence, to instill fear in witnesses to keep them silent. All of this violence against victims, witnesses, and others factors into the analysis of the defendant's dangerousness." Now, to be clear, this might not have anything to do with Steve Stoute. We've done previous sidebars on who those people might be. These are people that might have already sued Sean Combs recently, and they may actually be witnesses for the government. But maybe Steve Stoute's a part of this case. Maybe he's somebody the government has spoken to. How expansive will the prosecution of Sean Combs be? Could it include this incident? So to talk about this story and how it might connect to the current criminal case, especially in the fact that it's resurfacing now in light of Combs' current legal predicament, I want to bring on Dave Aronberg, who is the Palm Beach County State Attorney and host of the True Crime MTN show on the Midas Touch Network. You can check it out on YouTube. Dave, so good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on. What are your thoughts on this?
Good to be with you, Jesse, and thanks for plugging True Crime MTN, my YouTube channel. As far as Diddy is concerned, this is terrible for him in the court of public opinion. He's had a lot of hits lately, more than 100 new victims that have come forward, and there's a reason why he is being kept behind bars pre-trial, because he's seen as not only a flight risk, but a danger to the community. The one thing I can say about this matter with the studio executive is that it should not come into his forthcoming trial. You cannot bring up past bad acts to prove propensity evidence, meaning he's a bad dude, he's guilty. No, because it doesn't have anything to do with the current allegations. Now, if it was sex trafficking, then you could possibly bring it in. But just showing that he's a guy with a quick trigger, a short fuse, is not enough to get it admitted. But it does make him look really bad in the court of public opinion.
Can we break that down a little bit in the sense we're talking about an event that is before the period of time that prosecutors have laid out for their alleged conduct? So remember, they say that Sean Combs engaged in sex trafficking, racketeering, these freak-offs, all of this from about 2008 to 2024. From a time point of view, legally speaking, aside from the fact whether or not this incident is even related to the current charges, could prosecutors, and can we expect prosecutors to introduce evidence from the 90s, from the early 2000s, to support their charges against Sean Combs?
One of the reasons why racketeering charges are a prosecutor's best friend is that not only does it allow you to combine incidents and create a much tougher penalty for them, but allows you to look back in time more than you would otherwise. Normally, there's a statute of limitations, says you can't charge for crimes beyond a certain point. But if this is a pattern of activity, an ongoing criminal enterprise, racketeering statutes allow you to look backwards even more, where you can go through a statute of limitations. Now, in this matter, I'm not sure if this would be allowed in under a racketeering statute. Also, he was charged with this apparently and got away with it. So you can't charge someone twice for the same crime. So I don't think this is coming in. It makes him look bad, but I don't think it comes in because it would be propensity evidence. And if it didn't, then it would be overturned on appeal. Plus, since it's already been charged in the past, they wouldn't charge him again for it.
What about if Sean Combs were to take the stand in his own defense? Can they use this to under cross-examination?
Yes, it could be used for impeachment purposes. Sean Combs will take the stand in his defense. That would be so stupid. They could come up with all these other allegations, and yes, they'd be able to bring this up because he would say, I'm not a violent person. That's where you bring it up. So yes, you are right to bring up that exception, but I don't anticipate he will take the stand, and I don't anticipate this to come in to his trial.
Let me ask you this. I want to go back to the specifics of this. You said he basically got off. Why would they reduce the charge from what was a felony charge to harassment? I mean, according to the New York Post, back in 1999, it was reported that Stoute had told prosecutors that he didn't want Combs to be convicted of a crime, indicated that he and Combs had worked out their differences. So is this a matter of we don't have our star witness who's cooperative anymore? Is there another reason you could see why it was reduced?
Prosecutors only have what the witnesses will give them. And here you have the victim saying, let it go, let it go. That's very hard. I mean, that for a prosecutor, you got to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you have a recalcitrant victim, that makes your case that much harder. That's why you would plead something down. Same thing for the reliability of other witnesses and other evidence there. If the victim is saying this was just a misunderstanding, then how are you going to get a jury to convict beyond a reasonable doubt for the toughest charge? So now hindsight is 2020. He's thinking, man, he could have killed me. Well, you should have pushed it more forcefully back then. It's one thing. He did come forward with the charge. That was good for the complaint. But you got to see it through.
Explain this to me, too. So he ends up settling with Mr. Stoute, $500,000 payment. It's out-of-court settlement, but it's not categorized as a form of compensation per se. It was labeled as producer and management fees. And considering Stoute was looking for $12 million for the attack, that one was interesting, too, both the amount and how it was actually labeled or categorized. Can you explain that?
Perhaps it was labeled that way to give Diddy a tax deduction as a business expense. And maybe that was part of the settlement. Like, hey, you can give me this much, or we'll label it in a way where you can get a deduction and I'll get this much. So I can see that happening, which means the hands are not totally clean on both sides of this. But also Diddy wanted this to be thrown under the rug where it's not compensation for doing anything wrong, but rather a business fee. So another way that he has continued to be enabled throughout his whole life to continue to act badly until finally it's caught up with him.
You know, it's interesting. If I was following this back in the day, I also don't know how old I would be when this was going on. I'd have to do the math. But if I was thinking about this, you know, I would say Sean Combs burst into this guy's office, beat him up, threw a chair, overturned the table, had his guys with him beat him up too. This is an incredible story. But ever since that Cassandra Ventura video came out from CNN publishing it of him beating her up in 2016 in a hotel hallway while only wearing a towel. I think that's changed the whole perception that you might have to believe everything that he's accused of. Now, that's not fair, right? Because this one incident doesn't mean that he's a sex trafficker. It doesn't mean that he's engaging in racketeering. It doesn't mean he blew up somebody's car. It doesn't mean he kidnapped somebody, all these charges. But that video, and when you think about the other videos that the prosecution might have, you look at all these allegations in a very different light.
People lie, video does not. And it's one thing for you to accuse Diddy of bad conduct, especially when you ended up settling with him civilly. Then Diddy could say, yeah, he's just trying to make money. I paid him off. His word versus mine. And who are you going to believe? This guy you've never heard of, who's a studio exec, or me, superstar, megastar, who is beloved by everyone? Until the video comes out of Cassie, then you can't ignore it any longer. And you're right. Had that video not come out, I don't think you would have even seen, by the way, this case against him, because it would be more he said, she said, he said, until everyone gets paid off, and then he continues to act this way. It was the video, I think, that broke this whole thing open.
Well, it's interesting because if you listen to prosecutors in their filings, they say they didn't even know about, well, they knew about it, but they didn't see the tape. They didn't have the tape until CNN published it. Clearly helped their case, but they were already investigating Sean Combs for quite some time before that.
Yes, you can investigate, but when that video comes out, that's so devastating and damning. It makes your case so much stronger. So yeah, possibly that it was the civil lawsuit by Cassie, but the civil lawsuit by Cassie was buttressed by the video. And just a civil lawsuit alone is not going to convince prosecutors to seek an indictment. But a civil lawsuit plus video corroboration could.
Looking at this whole incident with Steve Stoute, I just want your reaction to not only what we just talked about, this really harrowing event, but let me read you what Stoute said at the time, because I think it's really interesting in light of what Combs is accused of now. He said, if this kind of behavior is allowed to go unpenalized, it'll be like an invitation for extortion in the music business. If somebody can get away with walking into the headquarters of the world's biggest record company and beating up a senior executive over a disagreement, I guarantee you this is going to be a great business for criminals to thrive in. What are your thoughts on that, Dave?
I agree with him, but if he really thought that way, he should have prosecuted this, pushed this to the fullest extent of the law back then. Instead, he settled civilly, and prosecutors downgraded the charges. If you really want to prevent this from happening, you get this guy prosecuted and convicted of the most serious charge. But money often gets in the way because you have civil lawsuits, which cause a victim to not be as aggressive, not want to push this further. And people like that are able to get away with things a lot longer. Now, I credit this person for even claiming victim status and making sure that Diddy was arrested. Others would have said nothing. So I give him credit for that. But if you really want to stop this bad behavior, this criminal behavior allegedly from happening, you got to just work with prosecutors and law enforcement to make sure the person is held accountable to the fullest extent of the law.
Dave Aronberg, thank you so much for coming on. Again, you can check out True Crime MTN, Midas Touch Network on YouTube. Dave breaks down not only criminal cases, he talks about political, legal cases as well. One of our great legal minds. Thank you so much for coming on, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse. Love your show, man.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.